There are more than 5 million documents in the Epstein files. Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
Part of this episode was filmed in mid-December 2025, and the main part was filmed on January 3rd, 2026. Did you have anything you wanted to say for the Epstein files? It came out only recently. We already have a lot to talk about. I normally like to have the media do my thinking for me first so I can reply to it. It's like cognitive saves some time. But if you have something to say about it, we could begin with that.
Not very much. I took a look at some of it and listened to the news about it and what people read, and no real surprises. It's pretty much what we talked about before, that a lot of it's redacted, that they didn't release everything clearly because they announced that they didn't release everything, that they're still going through stuff and getting information even more. There's nothing too surprising in there in terms of new information. If anything, the one thing I found surprising was that there were some redactions for national security reasons, which means that the running theory that there were some kind of intel implications are still ongoing, at least in my mind, but some of the information they gleaned is being used for something, and that they just don't want the information out there. They must be hiding it for some reason, and it can't just be because Trump's in the files. Just the sheer volume of what was redacted, I don't think he's the only reason that it was all redacted. Also, yes, protecting the victims' names and images, of course. But the reason I say that there might be a little bit more going on is Senator Wyden actually in that press conference was talking about it when they were looking at the suspicious activity reports and the money, following the money, that some of it looked like blackmail, but that they never followed up on it. So when you're talking about something like blackmail, that's one of the tools that's used in espionage and intel gathering. That's why I think that for some of these files may never see the light of day, or if they are heard about or seen, it'll be 50 years from now or 100 years from now. Like, they're going to be buried and we're just not going to see them. It's just because the circles he walked in they were vaunted air. They're like way, way up there in the hierarchy of the org chart, the power chart for some countries, that he knew prime ministers, he knew royalty, he knew very rich financiers, he knew presidents, right? We know he knew at least two presidents, Trump and Bill Clinton. So that just the sheer number of people that were in his proximity or that he talked to, I don't know, that there's got to be some intel value separate and aside from the criminal stuff. And there is a history of looking the other way for some criminal endeavors if they're using the criminality for national security reasons, right? So having an informant, for instance, that might be a money launderer, right, that they'll give them immunity and still have them as an informant. What's not clear to me is if anybody they may have discovered in the course of their investigation isn't still being used in an ongoing manner, right? Because Epstein died in 2019, which was when his second trial was going to happen. So a lot of those people are most likely still alive. So that's the one thing I noticed, was that there was just way more redactions. And one of the reasons that they can do a redaction was national security reasons. And they didn't provide a explanation for the redactions, which tells me that there's a reason they don't want to say in a public setting. There is something they're hiding, but it may not necessarily be all the criminals. Yes, there's probably people who were criminals in the orbit that weren't prosecuted, for sure. But the question in my mind is, because countries operate in this sort of gray area, they operate in the shadows for a lot of things. That's just the way that modern conflict is fought. That there's got to be he was so rich, right? He was very wealthy compared to what his actual job. He went from like a school teacher to being a guy who owns an island. So however that happens, that's the big question.
It's funny that because they can redact things for quote-unquote national security reasons. What are those national security reasons? It's classified. We can't tell you. But doesn't the law call for the release of the Epstein files, and is it implied therein, like all of the Epstein files that don't have some sort of compelling interest not to be released? Is this like a catch-22 thing?
No, there's no. So there are. If you read the law, there's actual exceptions presented in the law. There's national security, anything that affects intelligence. There's anything that's affecting an ongoing investigation. There's a handful of exceptions that are within the law itself. That even though it's all the Epstein files, quote unquote, it's not all the Epstein files, no matter what. That there's some elements within the files that just will never see the light of day, just by virtue of what they are, and we won't know. That's just the way that goes. Because ultimately, the president is the one who gets to decide classifying stuff as classified, and then there's other people in the government that can do that too. And I'm sure that they've scoured these documents for the many decades and years that they've been in the possession of the government, that they've gone through with a fine-tooth comb, figured out anything that was of any kind of intel value or security value, and we the public will not see it, right? Because Congress carved out that exception. Ultimately, if anything, that law was way too generous in terms of actually like seeking justice or the truth. But I understand why they would include it, but it's just a fact that it provided a lot of wiggle room, right? Because there's a handful of things that can happen right now that may just happen, right? That say any of these people are prosecuted, Trump still has a unilateral pardon power, right? So anybody who was acting to protect Trump's name from being released in the files, he can just pardon. Full stop. And unless they impeach Trump, right, he could just pardon quite literally ever. He can give, and what's crazy is he can give preemptive pardons, right? So even if no crime is ever committed, he can just say, if a crime is ever committed between now and the end of my term, this person is pardoned forever. That's what's so crazy about the pardon power, is that it's pretty much unchecked, and it can be a pardon for things that haven't happened. And it can be a blanket pardon in the case of what Gerald Ford did for Nixon, of just like all crimes committed, period, between a time period and another time period, whatever those crimes may be. And it's just waving a magic wand and saying this person is unblemished of soul and perfect of character, clearly, because they need to be pardoned.
Yeah. Okay, I guess I will write my congressman that I prefer that the full Epstein files be released. And it reminds me of what Kerry Kennedy says, that she knows what she's doing 3 years and 1 month from now with the inscription on that performing arts center in Washington D.C. Maybe we'll have to wait. I think that would be a pretty good presidential platform. It's like that one guy running for mayor of, what was it, New York City, and he said the rent is too darn high.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like a decade or more. Or
so yeah, he had a great slogan.
Yeah. I still remember today, and he had a great beard too. I remember both, but I was like, I will release the full Epstein files. If he just says that at the beginning of every remark, probably going to get elected president, I would say.
Look, something's got to give. So one of the congressmen raised a really great point, Ro Khanna from California, in an interview, that there's no statute of limitations on the law. So effectively, at some point, unless Trump's dictator for life.
And even then.
Oh yeah, even then. But technically, I guess he could do that like future pardon, that preemptive pardon. These people are innocent of all crimes now and in the future of this nature.
Oh boy.
It's okay. All right. No, that one's a little untested. We'll see if that one actually plays out. But he raised a good point that they can impeach these cabinet officials, which they might if the Democrats get a majority. I'm sure they will. If Eric Holder did an interview where he was saying that impeachment might have to be an option of these cabinet officials if they don't actually comply with the law. Because the Congress passed a law. The law is supposed to be absolute, right? Of whatever the law is as written, the government is supposed to do. That's how it works. The president signed it. It was one thing if Trump vetoed it, right? If he just said, nope, not going to do it. This goes into a memory hole. Just put it on some drawer on a desk and no one's ever going to see it. That he signed it means that effectively, like, they have to actually do it in some respects. That they have to do the whole song and dance of actually releasing the files and justifying to Congress why they're not releasing some of them. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, that's all I had to say about the Epstein files. They clearly didn't
Yeah.
release all of them. There's no way.
No, yeah. All right, cool. We'll wait for more. And now the part from January. So, it's January now, which in the Pacific Northwest is just, to me, the worst month because it's so dark and awful. I dream a dream that someday inhabitants of the Pacific Northwest will all get to get out, go to Arizona or Australia or somewhere nicer in this month. Just a little editorializing there before we talk about Epstein. Did you see the subsequent email that I sent you?
Yes, I was reading through it, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, Epstein Extra. According to an NBC News report, there are more than 5 million documents in the Epstein files. And we have not seen 5 million released. Some much smaller number has been released. Do you know the number of documents that has been currently released?
No, I don't know the exact number just because they're releasing them in. Have you ever heard of the term drip, drip, drip? That they're releasing
Yep.
them in batches. I'm not actually clear on the exact number because they keep releasing some at a time and they're doing these redactions. And so it's not entirely clear the exact amount that they've released. But also, when referring to the files, there's different categories of files. There's the files from the estate that the oversight committee got, which is different than the files that were just released by the DOJ. And I was reading through the full text of the law that they passed, and the files that are released by the DOJ are only related to the DOJ investigation of Epstein, which means that there's still plenty of files that may exist out there in the world that aren't related to the DOJ investigation, but are still related to Epstein. So that's the financial stuff. And my understanding from listening to press conferences and discussions about that is that there's a senator from Oregon looking into the financial stuff, the suspicious activity reports, and trying to get access to that from the banks and Treasury. So that's different. And that's not necessarily part of the Epstein criminal investigation.
Okay, so does the law mandate just that the DOJ files be released or that every file be released?
It's just the DOJ. So it's anything that the DOJ has in its possession. And the DOJ encompasses all of Homeland Security and the FBI and mainly domestic law enforcement. So there's a whole list of things that aren't necessarily included in the files. Anything that was collected for intelligence reasons probably isn't going to be included in the files. And then anything related to the financial stuff is probably not in the files unless they used it for the criminal investigation. They might have, but it's going to be tangential, meaning that it's not necessarily going to cover all of the financial transactions that Epstein made over the course of his career because they can't necessarily link those to any criminal activity because he made a lot of money independent of that. It's not clear that all of his money was derived from trafficking. That it's not even clear that he made any money from trafficking. It's quite possible that he only spent money. The whole thing there is we don't know because the files don't necessarily show that.
Yeah. If he wanted to, he might not have made money from trafficking, but he could have garnered a type of nefarious influence.
Yeah.
Which could have enabled him to make money.
Yes, so things like blackmail or things like deals, that's where it's not super clear on this, and he can't be asked because he's dead. But he could have made money simply by having compromising information on people, right? If he knew rich and powerful people, he could show up to them and say, "You're going to sign up for this financial deal, whatever it was, some fund or some trade or whatever." Because I think he was a money manager or something. I'm not exactly clear on how he made his money. I just know that he made a lot of money. And one of the ways that he could have made money was this stuff, right? Behind the scenes dealings where people were connected to him because of this criminal enterprise that he was engaged in. And they knew or were part of it. And he capitalized on that knowledge. That's something I think hasn't been looked into as much as it should have been at the time, both in the first time he was prosecuted and now this time. It was extremely strange that the co-conspirators were all given immunity in that first deal that he signed. Extremely bizarre. Right. That was super duper weird and is the exception. I don't think most criminal If you think of like a RICO case prosecuting the mob
Yep.
or gangs or any kind of conspiracy, they don't just make everybody immune except for one person. They prosecute like
Uh-huh.
everybody. That's the whole point of a RICO case. That you're saying, look, everybody was involved in this criminal enterprise. The only people that get any kind of immunity are those that turn state's evidence, right? That those in lower level of the pecking order of the chain turn on their higher ups. That I get, right? That they're informing on their superiors and may need to go into witness security. I understand that. And if there's an element of that in this whole thing, of witnesses that are in witness security, I can fully understand why they would be redacted. If there are people
Yeah.
who are actively in witness security right now that are being protected by the government, there's a no percent chance that their names are going to be released to the public, no matter what, no matter if Congress passes this law. And I can understand that rationale from the government if they're doing redactions where they're saying they have to follow other laws that exist on the books as well. Because one of those things is something like witness protection, right? Where there's somebody's identity is being protected actively because they participated in an investigation or a prosecution in which their lives are at risk simply by virtue of the fact that they were witnesses to a massive criminal conspiracy and the people who were involved in that criminal conspiracy are still out and about posing a risk to the lives of those witnesses. I understand that part. And we won't know, due to the redactions, if that is the case, precisely because they are redacted. And I get that. And that may be part of it. But we don't know. But certainly it's not going to cover millions of files if it's that case. It's going to be a few files for something like that.
You mention that some of the ways that Epstein made his money probably were legitimate. Nobody's just gonna do illegal things unless they're like straight to jail. You would do legal things so you could launder the money. So, of course, he would have had certain legal transactions. He worked for some kind of investment house.
It also gives the veneer of legitimacy. So for him to get access to the hallways of power. So think of Bernie Madoff. He wasn't just running a Ponzi scheme. He was also the head of a bunch of different organizations and institutions. He had an air of respectability about him that gave him access to rich and powerful people who then in turn made him money through whatever ways they were making money. It's not entirely clear, but it is clear that he made money. But yes, like I don't think he was prosecuted for the money side at all. It's not even clear that any of his activity financially was illegal necessarily, other than maybe the money involved with actually like trafficking, like actually spending the money to move people in a slave-like fashion, right? If you take them and then threaten their lives, their livelihood, their homes, because some of those things are in the files of people being threatened by Epstein if they didn't comply, right? That their house would be burned down or they'd be attacked or any number of like threats, right? If there was money spent in that regard, yeah, that's illegal, 100%, right? It's money spent in the commission of a crime. But it's not clear that all of his money was illegal in the way that he gained it.
I'm going to tell my daughter, when she's old enough to understand language, if anybody ever threatens to burn down the house, I've got a fire extinguisher. So you just tell me what they said, and I'll get the fire extinguisher ready. Or something like that. What an awful thing to say. So I'm curious what you think about this. You mentioned that a lot of his money may have been made legitimately. Probably much of it was. But he's dead, and he's obviously a public enemy. But are we still not going to know, is how he made his money legitimately? Is that going to be a private thing? Or are they going to tell all about it at some point?
Look, Congress has subpoena power. They have the ability, if they really want to pour over every day. So here's where it gets really weird is, at least from what I'm following in these public press conferences and discussions, is that they did have access during the Biden administration, at least in Congress, to some of it, if not all of it. They were looking at these suspicious activity reports, and then I guess they lost access during the Trump administration. So the question is like, why? What's going on there? Because Congress does have subpoena power. They have the ability to just issue subpoenas and then have those complied with and look at whatever it is they want to look at. Because they have there's certain exceptions carved out in the rules for Congress being able to pursue the truth, whatever the truth is. That's part of their job as Congress, is they're a truth-seeking body. They function as a entity in our government that looks for some semblance of what could be the truth. So the thing I'm thinking of is actually the unidentified aerial phenomena movement, where
Uh-huh.
for the longest time, the government was just not saying anything about UFOs, and it was treated as this joke and a conspiracy and a haha, let's make fun of those people who are talking about lights in the sky or whatever. And then all of a
Sure.
sudden, no, not really. It looks like there's a whole list of things that the government sees but doesn't quite understand. And they've got video and they've got documents and they've got investigations and they spent money on it. That's a function that Congress has of just looking into things and finding out some version of the truth of it so the American
Yeah.
people can have a better understanding of what it is that's going on in the world. Same deal here with this Epstein thing. He's not going to be prosecuted. He's dead. So there's nothing more to indict or charge for Epstein, but there's everybody in his orbit, right? That's why Ghislaine Maxwell was prosecuted, and anybody else that was involved should have been prosecuted unless they were an informant, right? Unless they directly negotiated with the government to help in the prosecution in some way that gave them immunity. Otherwise, I
Hmm.
don't see any reason why they should be escaping criminal prosecution for this stuff if they were involved in this massive criminal conspiracy, right? Slavery is a crime. Trafficking is a
Yeah,
crime.
certainly. I'm reminded of a quote from the movie with Meryl Streep, Amy Adams, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Doubt, which was from '08. It was in theaters in '08. Very good movie, I think. Also, not a subject matter for young children. Anyway, but she says, Meryl Streep says at the end, in the pursuit of wrongdoing, one steps away from God. Meryl Streep is a nun in this.
Yeah, I've seen the movie. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I feel myself, when you talk about UFOs, it's another aspect where a lot of the UFO sightings increased in the time when in America, like hallucinogenic drugs were also on the increase.
Uh-huh.
Now, a lot of that, and it turns out there's stuff that the government then investigated, so it really needed to be investigated. There's like forces going in opposite directions. The need to find out the truth and the need to live something of the need for the average person to live something of a stable and predictable life. And we rely on intelligence services and the Justice Department and law enforcement, frankly, to smooth out things and so that we can live in a society where generally our optimistic appraisals of things are true. But it doesn't always work that way because it's not. The world is not just happy Sunnyville. Look, it's January now. I'm thinking that everybody in the government needs to take this very seriously because here was a human trafficker who went from poor to multimillionaire with his own island, and he knew people in the highest echelons of authority. And it just stinks. It's just terrible. So I think we definitely need to know about his financial activity and make sure if he didn't make any money from the trafficking, great. But prove it, is what I would say. And for most things, you can't afford, you just can't be that like inquisitive about everything, like pointing at the screen harshly. You
Yeah.
can't just do that to everything. But for some things, they're so bad that you have to. So it's terrible that we got to this point.
Yeah, so if there were any other co-conspirators involved in this, they're still out and about. They haven't been prosecuted. They still pose a risk to the general public. 2019 wasn't that long ago, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if there were these rich, powerful people engaged in this abhorrent behavior, they still pose an ongoing threat to the public. They can't all have passed
Mm-hmm.
away like that one guy who committed suicide. Some may have died,
Yeah.
right? That's why their names were on redacted in the files. If they're dead, right, they're no longer being protected. But frankly, the law is pretty unambiguous that nobody's name should be protected for personal reputation or whatever. If they're in the file, they're in the files. The end. And that's why I understand why Clinton's spokesman came out and said just release all the files, right? Stop cherry picking names and pictures and whatever. Just release everything, right? Follow the law. It's pretty straightforward. look, if they didn't want to do this, Trump has veto power. He could have just said no. He has the right as president to just veto anything. That he signed it was bizarre in itself, right? Like he spent this whole effort and time trying to prevent its release, trying to exercise political capital to get people to not sign that petition. They went through a whole lot of effort to make sure it didn't see the light of day. And now that it is,
Mhm.
it's just this constant like struggle just to get the full amount of files out there. And it's incredibly bizarre, right? That they're still
Yeah.
engaging in a cover up. If they really wanted this to not see the light of day, veto it. He had that opportunity.
Yeah, I know. I can't. I can suspect his reasons for initially saying that it was a hoax. I'm glad he bowed to overwhelming public pressure, and I'm glad that this wasn't the political hill that he wanted to die on. But if we learn, as we learn here, that there are non DOJ files, the red flags go up again. And moreover, given that the files aren't out yet, there's over 5 million of them, and given that the law says they need to be out by now, they're giving existing agents overtime to sift through the files. But the fact that they're doing that now shows that they should have been doing it all along so that they could have complied with the law. Upholding the law is important,
If there's anything
obviously.
clear from this ongoing saga, it's that the moment that the law was passed, they should have hired as many lawyers and resources as they needed to get it done, right? In time. Because ultimately, they're funded and paid for by us, by the government, by Congress. And if Congress says do this, right, and they're the ones that pony up the money to do things, then they should have done it. That's what I don't get about this whole ongoing saga is the reticence. This oopsie daisy, we just found all these millions of files in the place where he was prosecuted. He was being prosecuted in 2019. Oops. It's criminal prosecutions don't generate any documents or discovery. It's like, what is that? They should have known from the start, and they probably did know from the start. It's there. It's just that they face public pressure once journalists caught on to the fact that these files are probably still out there and weren't being released, that something really fishy is going on here. It's incredibly bizarre, for instance, when the judges in the grand jury testimony said, okay, got to release the files now, a law was passed, and then they redacted full wholesale all of those grand jury files. Wait a second. If the law says that the files need to be released, they can't all. Some of those grand jury files are probably extremely mundane and very boring, of describing the weather or describing a day or
Yeah.
circumstance. Do they really all need to be redacted full sale? What's going on there? And the question, it just adds to more questions on the pile of questions of what are they hiding? What is being hidden here that's so important, and what is so
Mhm.
egregious in these files that the people in charge at the DOJ are willing to risk, frankly, being prosecuted or being held in contempt by Congress or even impeached by not being in compliance with the law? What is going on here? That, I think, is the big question. If the Democrats win in the midterms, there's going to be a lot more effort expended on this because it's very clear that Congress wanted these files released. They voted almost unanimously in the House, and in the Senate, it was unanimous consent. There's no real controversy here. No one's saying, don't do this. It's just a question of how severe they want the consequences to be for incentivizing the people employed by the American taxpayer to actually do their job, right? It shouldn't be this confusing or controversial. They're paid by the U.S. taxpayer. They have an obligation to do their job, to follow the law, to uphold the law faithfully. And right now, it doesn't look like it's being upheld, not by the plain
Mhm.
text of the legislation. Some
Yeah.
of these redactions are very confusing.
It's a situation in which the demands of the public were overwhelming and the law passed near unanimously. And we find that things are still hidden against the law. And so, let's go.
If there's anything more to say about this, it's that there's still more to go. When there should have been an air of finality in December 19th. They should have released it all. We should have had it all. Anything that needed to be redacted, okay, but it all should have been released otherwise. And that's that. Move on. Nothing more. No more to talk, yes, plenty to talk about because the files show all sorts of strange stories and things. What I think what makes the files so strange is that some of it is real and then a lot of it isn't, right? That a lot of it's that they just kept a record of the tips that were called in or the
Mm-hmm.
rumors, right? That they had a help or tip line or whatever, and people would call in and say all sorts of strange things leading up to the election. Not all of that stuff's going to be true. Just because something is said, just because something's hearsay, doesn't mean that it's actually true. And the question just then becomes, did they follow up with every one of these tips that they received to actually verify the validity of any of them? Because some of them are pretty egregious, if true, but it's not so clear that any of the things that are said are actually true. I
Yeah.
can understand that part of not wanting to put the files out in the world without actually verifying, because it would take a lot of investigative resources to
Sure.
track down every single one of these complaints. What is extremely clear, this is my last word on this, is that they have a complaint going back to the 90s that apparently wasn't followed up on to the degree that Epstein would have been prosecuted. So that means that the government has known to some degree for a very long time. And the question is, why was he being protected for so long? What was going on there? How did that deal end up happening that was good for Epstein? And also the blanket immunity for co-conspirators. What is that? I don't even. Anyways, that I don't know if the 2019 prosecution was going to have that same kind of agreement of immunity for co-conspirators. We'll never know, right? Because it was never fully hammered out since he died. Like, we won't know if the cover up was going to continue. But what's very clear, pretty much unambiguous at this point, is that there was some kind of cover up of something, of some information. Mostly, I think it's feet dragging that they just declined to prosecute. They declined to investigate further when they received certain complaints. Why? Like, why? Where was this reticence coming from? Was it just he was politically connected? Is it just the money aspect of it that he just knew rich and powerful people? But that's part of the saga that's in some ways not the saddest, but it's very sad because it shows the moral failing of the people who were supposed to be doing their job, not doing their job of investigating and prosecuting this particular person to the degree that he should have been way back when. Okay, sorry.
Cool.
No more. That's all I have to say about the Epstein files.
No need to apologize. That's why they call it Mondays
Bye bye.
with Mike.